Alright, here we go.
This is a global telephone link prepaid cell link from an inmate at a Maryland correctional facility.
From the closet in my room, it's Serial. One story and one day for a grade. I'm Ben. Alright, let's talk Serial. The case of Haymon Lee's murder in Baltimore, Maryland is the subject of the first season of the podcast. In it, Sarah Koenig covers the details of the murder, as well as developments made about the case years after the events took place. One thing that's always intrigued me about this case, though, is the trial of Adnan Syed, and the discrepancies in the testimony of Jay Wilds, mainly him lying in different interrogations, to the tone that Adnan's attorney, Christina Gutierrez, used in the trial.
To have a witness who has this benefit.
Looking at all the craziness that occurred in this trial, it becomes really clear why Sarah Koenig chose to cover this case in the first season of her podcast. One thing that I wish she did talk about more, though, and the subject of this video, is the debate around the effect of racial and religious prejudice in Adnan's case. That's not to say Sarah Koenig didn't talk about this topic at all. In fact, it takes up a good half or so of the 10th episode of the podcast, and is going to be the episode I'm primarily analyzing in this video. But I just wish she talked about it more, in general. Since she more so talks about the prejudice that Adnan faced, and not so much about someone like Jay or Have. Yet in analyzing the transcripts of the episodes of Serial, as well as other articles for outsider opinions, I've come to one conclusion. Racial and religious prejudice ultimately damaged Adnan's image, yet were not the greatest factor in the trial. I know, it's a big claim to make, especially when in the podcast Sarah Koenig states that she isn't really on board with the idea of racism and anti-Muslim sentiment being a big factor in the case. In response to Adnan's mother saying that she believes that the case went the way it did due to discrimination, Sarah Koenig says to the audience, quote, "You can hear me not believing her, right?" And, quote, "That I found very hard to believe. And I still don't believe that, by the way." Yet even then, she still realizes that maybe some discrimination influenced the case in some way. And I full-heartedly agree. Perhaps it wasn't the biggest factor in Adnan's conviction, but it definitely played a part in the trial leading to his incarceration. First, there's the hearing. In the Serial podcast episode, Sarah Koenig gives us an insight into the prosecution's thoughts. One of the points that Vicky Walsh makes in the hearing is a comparison with Adnan's case and a case also in Maryland that happened in which Samuel Steinbein had murdered a teenager and then absconded to Israel. She essentially states that Adnan's case is similar to the Steinbein one, saying that Adnan is a Pakistani male who was jilted by his girlfriend, and asserts the claim that Adnan has an uncle in Pakistan who can make people disappear, and will most likely flee to Pakistan should things turn south. Okay, so there's a lot to unpack here. I think the comparison of the cases is fair to some degree, but the assumption that Adnan is a powerful person who will flee the country much like the murderer Samuel Steinbein, and also has a mafia boss uncle, is a far stretch to say the least. To be fair, Vicky Walsh does apologize for this, as bad as it is. What she never does, though, is the fact that she incorrectly assumed Adnan is Pakistani. She never apologizes for this. He's an American with Pakistan heritage. Now, that's rough, because that doesn't paint a good picture for the prosecution. It shows that what they're willing to lead with in their argument is this idea that Adnan is an inherently scary and bad person based on shared characteristics between his case and the Steinbein case. But despite the slip-ups from Vicky Walsh, the prosecution seems to be really on board with the call to present cultural stereotypes as a form of motive for why Adnan may or may not have killed Hay. Prosecutor Kevin Urich in his opening statement states that Adnan was, quote, enraged and, quote, felt betrayed that his honor had been besmirched. This idea of a besmirched honor is a very outdated idea that Urich assumed in this case as a very popular and common ideal that Adnan subscribed to. So we see that amongst the prosecution, there's already some prejudice regarding race and religion, and that they use these stereotypes, cultural differences, and far-reach comparisons to build an argument against Adnan. This argument's effectiveness was only amplified when we look into the jury. Looking at the jury of the second trial, even though they were selected after many were deemed unfit to be a part of the jury on the case, there were definitely some issues that came with this particular group. They ultimately said to Sarah Koenig that Adnan's religious alignment didn't change how they viewed the case. However, some assumptions made about the culture definitely did change their perspective on Adnan, and by extension, the case in general. Juror William Owens said that when thinking about the case and Adnan's motive, he thought about his knowledge of culture. He states that he knows, quote, in some cultures, women are second-class citizens, and maybe that's what it was, end quote. And also, quote, he just wanted control, and she wouldn't give it to him. His assumption of what values Adnan inherits from his culture is also passed on to another juror, Stella Armstrong. She says that, quote, they were trying to talk about his culture, and Arabic culture, men rule, not women, end quote. So, we see that the jury clearly has their picture of what they think Adnan is like as a person. Someone who is very rash and honor-driven, which would clearly aid them in their deliberation when taking account whether or not Adnan would be capable of murdering Hay. It's also fair to mention that Cristina Gutierrez, whether you like her or not as a lawyer for Adnan, did try to explain words that might have been alien to a possibly anti-Muslim jury. Yet in the end, it doesn't seem to matter, since the jury ultimately based their decisions off of what they believed to be Adnan's character, leading to the perception that he was motivated by rage and a besmirched honor, therefore leading to his guilty verdict. So we've covered the reasons as to how race and religion have affected Adnan's trial, but there's one thing that, although wasn't talked about as much in the episodes of Serial, still remains, and that's the prejudice present in the initial investigation. In going back to this idea of this attachment to misogyny to Adnan's culture and by extension Adnan, one of the teachers at Adnan's school had said, quote, think about what he would have been taught about women and women's rights. Clearly referencing this misconception that Adnan's values are based around this idea of women being second-class citizens. On top of that, another teacher said that they were scared that, quote, Adnan's relatives were going to come after her for talking to the detectives, end quote. It's believed that Vicky Walsh got the idea of bringing up this idea of Adnan having a mafia boss uncle from one of the teachers, which, by the way, what is the logic here? I'm in high school and I don't know anyone who could possibly have ties to a criminal organization in a foreign country. But anyways, it can be clearly seen that throughout the investigation, a lot of the race and religious stereotypes influenced people to think Adnan's motivation to kill Hay was based off of said stereotypes, thus leading to Adnan being declared guilty in his trial. In looking at the case in general, a lot of people turn to stereotypes to point a motive for Adnan being Hay's murderer. Not just the thought of this being an honor killing, but the fact that Adnan was forbidden to date at all and did so anyway. Investigators and prosecutors portrayed Adnan and Hay's love as being forbidden. Both weren't allowed to date, so Adnan was seen as unfaithful to his faith and a duplicitous person. So let's recap this whole argument. Looking at the trial and the case in general, we can see that a lot of race, religious, and cultural stereotypes affected the outcome of Adnan's case. Many stereotypes and prejudices led to negative assumptions being made about Adnan, causing an establishment of a motive, and thus a reason to kill Hay. The culmination of all of this led to Adnan receiving a guilty verdict, and thus being incarcerated for his crimes. Though perhaps not the main reason for his jailing, racial and religious prejudice definitely influenced the outcome of Adnan's case. Whether or not things would have been different should this prejudice not exist will never truly be confirmed. But we do know for certain that it influenced the conclusion that was given all those years ago. I'm Ben, and thank you for watching.